At 5:42 on December 19, 1944, PFC Eddie Rourke lies frozen to a fallen pine in the Ardennes, the forest still dark enough that night and morning are indistinguishable. The thermometer nailed to the inside wall of his platoon's command post, 300 yards behind him, read 12 degrees F when he left. Out here, belly pressed into snow-crusted needles, it feels colder. The wind pushes through the trees from the northeast at 6 miles per hour, turning his exposed cheek into numb wood. His right eye floats just above the comb of the stock. The worn steel of his M1903A4 Springfield sits cradled in a natural depression of the log, barrel pointing through a jagged gap where shattered branches once were. On the gray, rough curve of bark beneath his cheek, the tiniest etchings run like a secret code. They are his, the frost-line markers. From anywhere else they are nothing, tiny scratches, no wider than the edge of a mess kit spoon, now packed with a skin of ice. From Eddie's angle, each thin pale line glows against darker bark, a frozen ruler marking the killing ground. 64 yards, 82 yards, 109 yards, 137 yards. He does not look at them now, he has already memorized them. Somewhere in the pre-dawn gloom ahead, 12 Germans move into position. He hears them before he clearly sees them. The slow, cautious crunch of boots on crusted snow, the rustle of field gear, a muffled curse in German when someone stumbles into a buried root. The forest is tight here, trunks standing at uneven intervals, branches sagging under a fresh dusting of snow that fell around 3:10. Eddie shifts his left hand, feeling the rough, sappy grain of the pine log beneath his glove. The tree went down in an artillery blast 3 days ago, its root ball torn out of the soil and left pointing at the gray sky like a ragged hand. He crawled inside its shadow the next night, measuring angles, distances, lines of fire. The log is his world now. He smells them before he sees them. Diesel, stale wool. A faint metallic tang of gun oil and cold steel, carried on the wind that slides down the shallow draw in front of him. There's another smell underneath it all, smoke from a German cigarette, probably hand-rolled, burning low and hot. His breath feathers in front of the scope, a ghost that could betray him, then is torn away by the wind. He blinks and settles his eye behind the 2.5x scope, the glass fogged at the edges from the temperature difference between skin and air. Through the narrow tunnel of magnification, the forest sharpens into layers. At the 64-yard frost line, the first shape slips into view. A helmet, a shoulder, the square silhouette of an MG-42 receiver, carried low by a broad-shouldered gunner in a field-gray greatcoat. 2 men trail close behind, ammunition belts looped over their necks like coiled brass serpents. They stop exactly where he expected. The fallen pine isn't just cover now, it's reference. Every scratch in the bark was cut by his hand. Every distance was paced off in exact steps, converted into yards, then marked into the wood with a knife heated briefly over a candle in the foxhole. The heat darkened the grooves. The night froze them. He hears a voice, muffled but recognizable even in memory from 2 nights prior. "Rourke, what in God's name are you doing to that log?" LT. Harkins had stood with his arms crossed, collar up, watching Eddie carve. "Marking ranges, sir," Eddie had said, not looking up. "You think you're decorating a Christmas tree? You've got better ways to waste time than scratching at bark." Behind the lieutenant, a sergeant had snorted. "Looks like a kid with a pocket knife. You carving your sweetheart's initials, Eddie." He'd kept working, just trying to see them before they see us, Sarge. Now at 5:42, no one is talking. The German machine gunner kneels, setting the tripod legs of the MG-42 into the snow with practiced precision. Eddie watches the angle. The barrel is being laid not toward him, but toward the gentle curve of a forest track 210 yards behind his position, where 2 American platoons will be walking in less than an hour. He hears metal on metal. The clack of the feed tray opening, the muted rattle as an ammo belt is laid in place. One of the ammo bearers shuffles his feet, rubbing gloved hands together. Another man, the squad leader by his bearing, raises binoculars, black ovals against a gray face, to scan the approach route. Eddie's heart is not racing. It is slow, heavy, like someone walking downstairs with a full pack. He shifts his weight a fraction, feeling the cold rot of the pine log pressing into his ribs, damp seeping through his field jacket. His trigger finger is numb inside the glove. He curls and uncurls it once, feeling the faint tack of dried oil on the trigger. He checks the 82-yard marker, a slightly longer scratch, aligned perfectly with a narrow gap between 2 trunks. A second gun team is moving there, 2 men with a spare barrel case and another with a field telephone slung over his back. 12 men total, 1 MG-42 primary position, 1 backup fire position, runners, ammo. Enough to cut down 60 to 70 Americans in less than a minute once the trap is sprung. The forest is quiet in the way that only places waiting for violence can be. snowflakes drift, carried sideways. Somewhere far to his right, a distant artillery rumble rolls across the line like an approaching storm. Rourke watches the squad leader raise his hand, fingers spread, then close into a fist, the universal signal to hold. He knows the timetable. He watched them rehearsing from this same log the previous morning in poor light. He saw where they placed their aiming stakes, how they walked the barrel over the track in sweeping arcs, presiding the kill zone for an unseen enemy. They are back now to finish the job. 14 minutes, that is all they need. Time to finalize their fields of fire, confirm range data, then melt back into the tree line until the Americans march into their sights. Eddie inhales slowly, the air tastes of iron and old smoke, his tongue feels thick, his lips have cracked, a thin line of blood drying along the corner of his mouth. He settles his crosshairs on the German squad leader's chest, at 5:44, a thin gust strips frost from the branches above, sending a powdering of ice down onto his helmet and collar. It trickles inside, cold as spilled water. He doesn't move. One shot will break the silence. One shot will announce his position to 12 men carrying a weapon that can fire up to 1,200 rounds per minute. One shot is the difference between 2 platoons walking into a massacre and 2 platoons walking through a quiet, empty forest. His finger tightens. The cold steel of the trigger is a dull presence under the pad of his finger, the slack already taken up. The crosshairs rise and fall with his breathing, settling each time on the black dot of a button on the German's tunic. He exhales, the world narrows to the line of sight, the distance, the marker on the bark that only he can see. He begins the trigger pull, cut to black, the voiceover cuts in over the darkness, steady and measured. In the next 14 minutes, everything would change for PFC Eddie Rourke, for 2 platoons walking toward a perfect German kill zone, and for a doctrine that never believed one quiet sniper's frozen marks on a fallen tree could rewrite the odds. Before the Ardennes swallowed him in snow and silence, before the frost-lined markers, before anyone knew the quiet steadiness of his hands could decide the fate of an entire platoon, Eddie Rourke belonged to another world entirely. He was born on August 11, 1922, on Rowley Street in the south end of Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, where the smell of hot steel never really left a man's clothes. Eddie grew up in the thin shadow of Jones and Laughlin Steel, the mill that owned the skyline, the payroll, the air, the lives. The mill roar was constant, steam hammers thudding through early mornings, whistles blasting every shift change, freight cars clanking across the rail spurs that cut the town like scars. Eddie's father, Patrick Rourke, worked as a heater, one of the men who stood closest to the furnace mouths, using long iron poles to turn billets glowing white-hot. His father's gloves were always singed. His eyebrows never grew back the way they were supposed to. His mother, Eleanor, worked evenings at a bakery 2 blocks down, kneading dough long after most families slept. Their house on Rowley Street was a cramped, drafty duplex with peeling green siding, the front porch tilted. The wallpaper inside carried a faint pattern of flowers beneath layers of coal dust. But it was sturdy and it was warm, and it held 3 people who worked harder than they talked. Eddie was a quiet boy, always was. Teachers called him observant. His father called him a thinker. Other kids called him odd. But he saw things others, angles in the baseball diamond, distances across the alley, how the wind curled around the old brick smokestacks. When he was 8, he hit 3 cans in a row with a hand-carved slingshot. When he was 9, he hit 6. By 12, he started bringing home pocket change from killing rats in the grain warehouse at the rail yard. The foreman told his father, "Your boy's got eyes like surveyor's pins." His father only said, "He sees everything, that one, everything." And Eddie did. The mill district raised him on measuring instinct, how far a thrown bolt would bounce across a floor, how long smoke hung in cold air, how fast rail cars rolled on a grade depending on their load. He absorbed numbers without thinking. They stitched themselves into him like thread. At 15, Eddie left school to apprentice in the J&L machine shop, the same building where his father had breathed steel for 20 years. His hands toughened quickly. Grease settled into the crease of every fingerprint. His knuckles cracked permanently from handling cold steel in winter. He started on cleanup duty, oily rags, sweeping filings, hauling scrap, but the foreman noticed the same thing the rail yard boss had. Eddie had a gift for geometry, not on paper, but in the world itself. He understood how things fit, how things aligned, how to file a bevel to an exact angle without a measuring protractor, how to judge the straightness of a cut by feel alone. By 17, he was helping adjust the guides on the shop's aging milling machines, setting tolerances that the certified machinists had struggled with. He handled calipers the way a violinist handles a bow, gentle, measured, deliberate. He worked full-time, 6 days a week, 5:40 a.m. to 3:10 p.m., lungs full of steel dust and the tang of cutting oil. He didn't complain, he didn't brag, he didn't talk much at all, but on Sundays, everything changed. Every Sunday morning, before the coke fires even warmed the mill, Eddie walked 2 miles into the wooded ridges east of town to hunt small game with a warn. .22 rifle his uncle had given him. The rifle was nothing special, stock cracked, bluing rubbed away, but Eddie learned every quirk of it. He learned how temperature warped point of impact, how humidity changed sound, how wind curled unpredictably through ravines. He studied birds the way some men study maps, watching how flight patterns shifted with terrain, how wings dipped in updrafts, how shadows fell based on elevation. By 18, his shot was legendary in quiet, unofficial ways. He could hit a bottle at 110 yards with iron sights. He could track a rabbit through brush by sound alone. But the real skill, the one no one else saw, was the way he measured distance without tools. He read tree spacing, slope angles, snow shadows. His mind turned terrain into silent arithmetic. And it was this ability, more than any other, that would one day carve a line of frozen marks into a fallen pine log in Belgium. On December 7, 1941, Eddie was working the late shift, sweeping filings from beneath a lathe whose gearbox whined like a wounded dog. It was a cold night, river wind cutting through every crack in the shop walls. The foreman's radio, always kept low near the tool rack, suddenly flared with frantic voices. Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, battleships burning, hundreds feared. The mill stopped. Even the machines seemed to fall quiet. Men gathered around the radio, grease-stained, tired, eyes growing wide not with fear, but with inevitability. One of the older machinists muttered, "God help us, this means war." Another spat into a coffee can. "About damn time we get some work worth doing." Eddie said nothing. But the next morning, after a silent breakfast with his parents, he told them, "I'm going." His father set down his fork, the sound sharp against the chipped plate. "You don't have to decide today. I already did." His mother wiped her hands on a dish towel, eyes shining but proud. "Just come back, that's all we ask." On December 10th, Eddie rode the early bus into Pittsburgh and presented himself at the enlistment office on Forbes Avenue. The recruiter barely looked 18 himself. The physical was quick, the paperwork quicker. Eddie Rourke became Private First Class, U.S. Army Infantry, serial number 33,298,174. He boarded a train 2 weeks later, heading south to basic training. His mother packed him bread. His father packed him a folding penknife with a worn handle. He didn't know then he would use that knife, that exact knife, to carve range markers into a fallen pine on the other side of the world. Eddie trained at Camp Wheeler, Georgia, arriving on January 3, 1942, stepping off the bus into red clay mud and humidity that felt like sweat you couldn't wipe away. Training was relentless. 20-mile marches, obstacle courses, bayonet drills, rifle instruction under the sun, night exercises in thick southern brush. Eddie excelled at anything that required steady hands. During the rifle qualification tests, the instructors watched him with growing interest. He didn't just shoot well, he shot consistently. His groupings were unnaturally tight for a recruit with no formal marksmanship training. On one memorable afternoon, Sergeant Larkin Gruff, square-jawed, unimpressed by anyone, stood behind Eddie as he adjusted his sights. "You're overthinking it, Pennsylvania," he muttered. "Quit trying to measure the whole damn field. Just shoot." Eddie didn't respond. He inhaled, exhaled, squeezed. The round struck the bullseye dead center. Larkin grunted. Well, even a blind hog finds an acorn." But he watched Eddie differently after that. The other recruits noticed too. They called him tape measure, then surveyor, then simply eyes. The nicknames meant nothing to him. He focused only on improving, refining, understanding. One night during a night fire exercise, Eddie corrected another soldier's wind estimation by sight alone, without a tool. The instructor frowned. "How'd you figure that?" Eddie shrugged. "Tree lines leaning, smokes drifting to the left. That's a 4-mile wind from the west. It's 3, feels like 4. They checked later with an anemometer the instructors kept for training accuracy. It read 4 mph. The other recruits joked, Rourke's reading the air again, but there was a quiet respect in their voices. Slowly, officers took notice, but only to a point. He was still an enlisted man, still quiet, still more comfortable with distances than conversation. And in the Army of 1942, brilliant enlisted men were often treated as anomalies, not assets. After training, Eddie was assigned to the 99th Infantry Division, specifically 394th Infantry Regiment, E Company. He met his squad at Camp Maxey, Texas, during final unit preparations before deployment. They were a mixed bunch: farm boys from Iowa, miners from West Virginia, a carpenter from Nebraska, a butcher from Wisconsin. The Army collected men like America itself, rough, stubborn, proud. There was Corporal Jim Tully, loud and broad-shouldered, whose laugh shook tents, PVT, Frank Devereaux, a wiry kid from Chicago with fingers always tapping. PVT Henry Madsen, farm-raised, quiet, steady as bedrock, and PVT Joe Vargas, who carried a guitar and swore he'd be a singer after the war. They made room for Eddie, but cautiously. He didn't talk much, didn't brag, didn't gamble, didn't drink. He watched the ground, the horizon, the clouds, always measuring, always calculating. One evening, Vargas found him pacing distances between tent poles. "You surveying for the Army Corps of Engineers now," he joked. "Just getting a feel for the camp layout," Eddie said. "You always gotta know where everything is." Eddie nodded, simple as breathing. Vargas shook his head. "Guy like you's either gonna save us or scare the hell out of us." The officers saw his marksmanship scores and assigned him as a designated marksman for his squad, but not as a sniper. Snipers required special training, and the Army was slow to recognize individual potential. To most officers, he was just another infantryman with a decent shot. One lieutenant joked during briefing, "If Rourke starts carving on trees out there in Europe, someone take the knife away from him." The men laughed. Eddie didn't. He knew what measured knowledge could do. He knew what precision meant when rounds were real, not blanks. He knew distance saved lives, and he knew no one else saw the world that way. The 99th Infantry Division shipped out on October 3, 1944, boarding the troop transport SS John Erickson at the New York harbor. The air was cool and salt-stung, the sky washed over with early autumn gray. Eddie stood at the railing as Manhattan shrank into a silhouette. He kept his hands in his pockets. His squadmates joked, sang, fought seasickness, played cards on deck boxes. Eddie mostly watched the waves, studying their rhythm, noting how the ship's wake curled depending on wind direction. Vargas nudged him. "You measuring the ocean now, eyes?" Eddie shrugged, "just seeing how it moves. It moves the same everywhere." Eddie shook his head. "No, it doesn't. The crossing took 10 days, men crammed into bunks 3 high. The smell of diesel and sweat soaked the corridors. Seasickness hit half the company. Eddie wasn't one of them. He spent hours on the upper deck, letting the cold wind slap his face awake. They landed in Le Havre, France on October 13th, stepping into mud so thick it tried to steal boots with every step. The port was a skeleton of ruins from months of bombing, twisted girders, cratered roads, burned-out cranes. The wind carried smoke and a faint hint of dead fish from shattered warehouses. From Le Havre, the 394th Regiment marched up country toward Belgium through towns where windows were boarded, roofs missing tiles, wells frozen in the mornings. Civilians watched them pass with weary eyes. By mid-November, they reached the Ardennes, relieving units along a thin defensive line that most officers believed would remain quiet through winter. Eddie stepped into a world of dark forests, rolling hills, and early snow, terrain that rewarded men who understood distance, angles, and silence. He breathed deeply. It reminded him of Pennsylvania's woodlots in winter. It felt familiar, manageable, measurable. What Eddie didn't know, what no one knew, was that within a month the Germans would launch their last great offensive, and the Ardennes would become a crucible of chaos, fog, and sudden death. A place where a quiet man with a frontier hunter's skill and a machinist's precision would carve salvation into a fallen tree. And those little frost-filled scratches, dismissed, mocked, ignored, would save more lives than anyone believed possible. By early December 1944, the 99th Infantry Division held what higher command believed to be a quiet sector. Maps painted the Ardennes as secondary terrain, dense woods, broken ridges, shallow valleys, all thought unsuitable for heavy German maneuvering. The official doctrine that filtered down to Eddie Rourke's regiment reflected that belief. Patrol predictable routes, hold fixed strongpoints, maintain interlocking fields of fire, and trust that any German activity would be limited to scattered probes. Doctrine, in short, believed the forest would behave, but the forest did not. The Ardennes warped sound, masked movement, and swallowed entire platoons in shadow. Snowfall muffled footsteps. Temperature inversions made voices travel in unpredictable arcs. Worse, the thick firs created narrow chutes, natural funnels, where an MG-42 team could turn even a small clearing into a killing ground. Yet paperwork insisted otherwise. Each dawn, the XO posted patrol grids drawn from a map that traced clean, straight lines through terrain that was anything but. The routes didn't account for subtle shifts in elevation or the way the early sun flared across frost and blinded riflemen. Nor did they consider the one thing Eddie saw immediately. German machine gun teams were choosing corridors that doctrine never accounted for. In the first week of December, the company suffered 3 ambushes along routine patrol paths. Each time, officers blamed bad luck, enemy initiative, or lack of discipline. Eddie knew better. He studied each ambush site the way a machinist studies a misaligned part, quiet, methodical, persistent. He walked the ridgelines before dawn, noting where the wind cut strongest, how snow drifted unevenly, how the slope of the ground changed the angle of sight by a mere 5 or 6 degrees, enough to hide a man's silhouette. He measured by instinct, he measured because no one else would. During one briefing, a lieutenant dismissed concerns by tapping a doctrine manual with irritation. "These woods don't change," he said. "The enemy does." But Eddie saw the opposite. The enemy was consistent. The woods were the ones shifting light, snow, angles, sound every hour of every day. He tried to warn them. "Sir, the corridor along Hill 602 bends toward a blind pocket. If an MG-42 sits in the notch, they'll—" "Rourke," the lieutenant interrupted, "your job is to shoot, not redesign the Ardennes." The men chuckled. Eddie said nothing, but inside something tightened, a hinge clicking toward failure. War is often measured in miles. In the Ardennes, it was measured in yards and corpses. 1 PVT. Samuel Smitty, Langford, age 19, hometown, Swoyersville, Pennsylvania. The first loss came on December 7th, just after dawn. Smitty Langford, thin, nervous, but quick with a joke, walked point for a routine 3-man patrol. They crossed a shallow draw flanked by pines bowed with ice. Eddie watched them leave, noting silently how the path funneled toward a low berm. 20 minutes later, the forest cracked open with a sound like tearing canvas. MG-42 fire, short bursts, controlled, professional. They brought Smitty back on a poncho, snow melting pink around the edges. 3 rounds stitched across his chest. His helmet was gone, his face was gray. A sergeant muttered, "Damn kid wasn't even shaving yet." Eddie stood still, staring down at the angle of the entry wounds. The shots came from higher ground, 64 to 80 yards away. Classic enfilade fire. He knew exactly where the gun team had been. He knew because he had walked that corridor the day before and sensed the danger. And no one had listened. 2 CPL, Henry Madsen, age 23, hometown, Boone, Iowa. 2 days later, CPL, Henry Madsen, a farm-raised ox of a man who rarely swore, died trying to drag a wounded scout behind a boulder. Another MG-42 burst caught him across the back, spinning him forward into the snow. The platoon medic tried to save him. Couldn't. The company chaplain wrote his name in a small, worn ledger. Eddie wrote something different in his mind. Estimated range, 120 yards. Angle of elevation, 7 degrees. He traced the geometry of the kill zone long after the body was carried away. 3 PVT. Carlo Benetti, age 21, hometown, Newark, New Jersey. Benetti was hit on December 10th by ricochet fire while hauling ammunition crates from a supply jeep. A single MG-42 burst snapped through the trees at random, 1 round slicing across his throat. He died in 10 seconds, gurgling softly in the arms of his best friend. Benetti used to sing Italian love songs at night. Now his bunk stayed empty, blankets still rumpled. The company whispered, "Where are they hiding? How do they see us before we see them? Why do they always know the angles?" Eddie knew why. The Germans weren't improvising. They were applying mathematics, they were reading the land, they were doing what he did, only better, faster, without bureaucratic rules holding them back, and more Americans would die because of it. The breaking point came on December 12th, shortly after 1600 hours. A reconnaissance patrol moved through a narrow glade north of company lines, a spot Eddie had identified as a natural converging point for fire. He had warned them, he had pointed to the slight depression in the snow, the way the tree line angled inward, the unusual quiet in that section during wind shifts. "It's a perfect machine gun pocket," he'd said. The lieutenant skimmed his report. "Appreciate your enthusiasm, Rourke, but we're following the map, not guesswork." Eddie wanted to argue, but he wasn't a man who fought with words. At 1607 hours, the forest cracked. MG-42 fire erupted in a half-second roar, an unmistakable rip. Eddie and 3 others sprinted toward the sound, weaving through pines as rounds smacked into trunks around them. When he reached the glade, he saw 3 bodies crumpled near the icy creek bed. One survived long enough to speak. PVT. Walter Ricks, 20 years old, from a small town in Kentucky. Quiet kid, always shared his rations. Laughed too easily, now he lay on his back, snow melting under his blood, chest heaving in shallow, broken rhythm. Eddie knelt beside him. Ricks whispered, "Thought path was clear." Eddie squeezed his hand. "I know." Came from that notch. His eyes drifted toward the exact blind pocket Eddie had marked days earlier. Ricks coughed, a soft, wet sound, then whispered, You said it, you saw it," and then he died. The forest seemed to exhale. Wind rustled, snow shifted. Somewhere in the distance, the MG-42 team was already relocating. Eddie felt the weight of Walter Ricks's cooling hand. He felt the immense silence after the chaos. He felt the cold grip of realization. If he did nothing, more men would die. If he acted, he would break rules, but the rules were killing them. That night he barely spoke. Vargas tried to lighten the mood. Tully offered whiskey. Eddie shook his head. He stared into the dark woods around him, counting angles, distances, possibilities. The gears inside his mind, those same gears forged in a Pennsylvania machine shop, began turning toward a single inevitability. He would fix the flaw no one else would, even if he broke Army doctrine doing it. He spent 3 hours drafting a hand-drawn map of terrain choke points, suspected German firing pockets, and ranges. He took it to LT. Harkins during morning briefing. "Sir, if we adjust our patrol routes," Harkins didn't look up. "Rourke, I don't have time for amateur cartography." "It's not amateur, sir. The terrain is the terrain. Our directives come from battalion." A sigh. "Go get some sleep." Eddie folded the map without a word. He walked out quietly. He didn't sleep. 2 days later, he approached the company. He returned to his foxhole just as dawn crept over the treetops. His hands were numb, his joints stiff, but his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do. He knew where to wait. He knew the Germans would come. And when they did, he would be ready. Not with doctrine, not with theory, but with frozen mathematics etched into bark. A system no officer would have approved. A system no manual ever taught. A system that would, within days, save the lives of 2 entire platoons. The forest was a vault of frozen breath at 3:00 hours on December 17, 1944, when PFC Eddie Rourke returned to the fallen pine. The tree lay at a slight downward angle, bark blackened from exposure, roots jutting into the air like frozen ribs. Snow whispered lightly from a cloudless sky, flakes drifting slowly enough to sparkle in moonlight. Eddie had brought only what he trusted: his father's penknife sharpened on the back of his mess kit, a steel file from his repair pouch, a ration candle for soot, a short length of paracord for improvised measuring. His M1903A4 Springfield clanged, oiled and ready. The forest was utterly still. Cold bit into his cheeks, down his neck, into the joints of his fingers. When he breathed, frost formed instantly along the edge of his scarf. He placed his gloved palm on the bark. The pine felt like stone. He began by pacing distances in the snow, his strides soft, measured, silent, counting terrain. Counting death, counting potential salvation. He returned to the log and knelt. Moonlight filtered through the skeletal canopy, glinting off the frozen grooves he had carved days earlier. They were too shallow, too few. Too vulnerable to fresh snowfall. He wiped frost from the bark and drew the knife. Scratch. A delicate line formed, 1/7 deep, clean, straight, parallel to the trunk grain. This was 64 yards, the closest threat point. Eddie leaned back, aligning his left eye with the notch of the tree, testing visibility. From his shooting angle, the line caught just enough frost to gleam. From any other direction, the mark disappeared completely into rough bark. Perfect. He carved the 82-yard marker next, slightly wider, angled purposefully to correspond with a narrow lane between 2 pines. Then 109 yards, then 137, then 160. 5 original marks became 9, each calibrated by stride count triangulation and adjusted for the tree's subtle tilt. He tied paracord to 2 branch stubs, using it to check perpendicular alignments, running it across bark like a primitive plumb line. A machinist's geometry in a winter forest. On the far underside of the trunk, hidden from all but someone lying prone, he engraved tiny submarks, micro-adjustments for elevation shifts in extreme cold. A technique no doctrine manual even mentioned. His hands trembled from cold. His breath fogged the bark as he leaned close, melting frost, revealing clean grooves. He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved the ration candle. Lighting it would risk discovery, but without soot, his marks wouldn't hold. He shielded the flame with his body, letting black smoke roll over the blade of the penknife. He used the sooted knife edge to darken the grooves ever so slightly. Not enough to be seen from 10 feet away, but from his firing position, perfect contrast. He scraped a finger along the bark. Sap had frozen into amber nodules. He softened some with a match, using it to seal frost into place so the lines would catch morning light differently. By 04:10, the range ladder was complete, a sniper's ruler carved into nature. A silent geometry of survival, a system that belonged to no army in the world. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He simply leaned his weight into the pine, listening to the winter forest settle around him. Snow ticked softly against his helmet, a branch cracked far off in the dark. Then he slung his rifle over his shoulder and crawled into his foxhole. The cold followed him, but so did purpose. It was built. And if he was right, the moment to use it would come soon. Dawn, December 18, 1944. A pale ribbon of light crept across the eastern sky, coloring the snow in shades of gray-blue. Eddie returned to the pine before the sun fully rose. Visibility was barely 120 yards, perfect for testing. He lay prone behind the log, nestling into the groove he had carved in the snow the night before. The rifle rested on the flattened section of bark he had smoothed with the file. He lined up the scope with the 82-yard marker. He inhaled, held, squeezed. The shot cracked through the forest, flat, sharp, cold. A puff of snow jumped off a distant oak where the round impacted. He cycled the bolt. Even that motion felt louder in winter air. He filed a touch of tallow, saved from breakfast bacon, onto the bolt rails. He moved the action again. SLLLCK, nearly silent, better. He adjusted the scope 2 clicks left to compensate for frost-induced contraction. Bullet speed dropped in extreme cold. He estimated a reduction of about 90 FPS at this temperature. It meant aiming slightly high at long ranges. He tested again. At 109 yards, hit. At 137 yards, hit again, half an inch low. He corrected a German patrol. 6 men appeared suddenly on the far ridge, no more than 25 feet away. Eddie froze, breath stopped. The nearest soldier's boot brushed snow from the very log he lay behind. Eddie kept still. A statue shaped from fear and discipline. The Germans murmured to each other softly, complaining about cold, joking about Americans sleeping in warm tents. Their boots creaked, their gear rattled, their breath fogged the air. Then they moved on. Eddie didn't exhale until the last man vanished around a bend. He resumed testing at once. He used soot to create tiny wind indicators along the underside of the log, just enough so the shift of smoke residue would tell him wind direction at a glance. Then he tested the rifle resting angle on bark. He shaved the groove slightly deeper to eliminate lateral drift. By mid-morning, the system was nearly perfect. He sat in silence, watching the forest breathe frost. His hands were numb. His cheek burned from lying against frozen bark, but the ritual was complete. This hide, this improvised geometry of distance and frost, was ready. The warning came at 1700 hours on December 18th. 3 scouts from B Company returned breathless, snow crusted into their eyebrows. "They're out there," the lead scout said. "MG-42 team, maybe more, setting up along the forest track." What? The officers barely reacted until the scout added, "There's tripods, aiming stakes, wooden range markers. They're planning something big." Eddie felt a chill sharper than the weather. He asked the scout how many men. 12, at least 2 crews. They're pre-sighting everything." Eddie knew what that meant. A machine gun team pre-sighting was death on rails, a mechanical certainty, a slaughter designed before the enemy even stepped into the clearing. Captain Rawlings dismissed the panic. "Probably reconnaissance," he said. "They won't try anything major in this cold." But Lieutenant Harkins frowned at the map. 2 platoons, 68 men, were scheduled to move through that corridor at first light. Vargas spoke quietly. "Eddie, that's your kill zone, isn't it?" Eddie nodded once, slow, grim. He stepped forward. "Sir, I'll go." Harkins barely looked at him. "You'll freeze out there." "I'll manage." A long silence, then Harkins exhaled. "All right, 1 man overwatch. You're at Rourke, don't start carving trees again." Eddie didn't answer because the trees were already carved. Statistical reality. Chance of a lone rifleman stopping a 12-man MG-42 ambush. 6%. Chance of saving both platoons intact. 2%. Chance the Germans would reposition if they detected him. 100%. Eddie accepted those numbers. Numbers never frightened him. He left camp at 4:20 on December 19th, frost cracking under his boots, rifle slung low across his shoulder, breath pluming in rhythmic pulses. When he reached the fallen pine, the world was still dark. Wind cut from the northeast. Snow drifted through the low branches. Visibility 140 yards. He slid into position. Range lines glowed faintly with frost. His pulse slowed. His breath steadied. His fingers curled along the stock. From far off, footsteps crunched. Voices murmured. Metal clinked. An MG-42 tripod locked into place. They were coming. And Eddie Rourke, the quiet machinist from Rowley Street, lay waiting behind a dead pine, armed with nothing but a rifle, a penknife's worth of geometry, and the stubborn belief that he could rewrite the next 14 minutes of war. Everything was in place. The engagement was about to begin. When the firing stopped at 5:56, the forest held a silence so complete it felt unnatural, an acoustic void left behind by violence. Snow drifted gently through the settling haze of gun smoke. The bodies of the German MG-42 team lay scattered in a jagged arc, their ambush positions shattered, their pre-sighted kill zone broken. PFC Eddie Rourke stayed behind the fallen pine for nearly 3 minutes, rifle shouldered, watching for movement. His breath plumed softly. His cheek was numb against the stock. His pulse barely rose above resting. Only after he confirmed no survivors remained did he slowly lift his head, scanning left, scanning right. The forest remained still. 2 platoons, 68 men, were now trudging toward the corridor. unaware that they had been spared a slaughter for which they had no counter, no preparation, and no warning. Word traveled quickly. Platoon scouts reached him first. They paused in awe at the bodies, Germans frozen mid-motion, ammunition belts spilling into snow, the MG-42 itself lying crooked across its tripod like a wounded steel animal. The killing lane ruthlessly engineered by the enemy now belonged to a single American marksman. Vargas arrived moments later, panting, eyes wide. "Eddie, what in God's name did you do here?" Rourke only nodded toward the clearing. "They were setting up, I stopped it." Tully whistled low, "By yourself?" Eddie didn't answer. The frost lines, still shimmering faintly on the bark, spoke for him. Behind the squad, officers approached cautiously, boots crunching across the icy ground. Lieutenant Harkins scanned the bodies, then the range markers, then Eddie lying behind the log, rifle still warm. Harkins muttered, almost under his breath, "You carved these yesterday, didn't you?" Eddie kept his gaze forward. "Yes, sir." The lieutenant's jaw worked for a moment, anger, disbelief, then something like sober respect. "Well," he finally said, "you've just saved 2 platoons. Pack up your rifle." What? It was the closest thing Eddie would ever receive to official praise. In the days following the ambush, an unusual pattern emerged, unusual enough that battalion staff made note of it in field reports. Before December 19th, the U.S. units in that sector suffered an average of 6-2 casualties per day from German ambushes. 2-3 losses per MG-42 engagement. Routine patrol attrition often exceeding 5% weekly. After Rourke's intervention, casualties in the 394th fell to under 2 per day. German machine gun harassment decreased by nearly 40%. Patrols avoided the corridor entirely, because Eddie's map corrections replaced the official grid for the rest of the week. A quiet line item in the regimental logbook noted, "Enemy ambush attempt prevented by superior marksmanship." From an enlisted rifleman. It didn't mention the range marks, it didn't mention doctrine failure, it didn't mention that the engineering of the forest, ridges, angles, sight lines had been redefined by a machinist with a penknife. But the numbers told the truth. Rourke had shifted the casualty curve in a single morning. Officers reacted with the caution of men who understood they had been wrong but lacked the authority or humility to admit it. LT. Harkins wrote a brief commendation draft, then discarded it. Captain Rawlings mentioned Rourke's good initiative, but only in conversation. Battalion command received a short note, ambush avoided, enemy neutralized. What? The Army had no category for the kind of innovation Eddie used. Doctrine manuals taught concealment, not geometrics. Sniper training emphasized fieldcraft, not topographical intuition. Engineering units built bridges and blew obstacles, not firing solutions into tree bark. So Eddie remained what he had always been, a quiet enlisted man in a cold forest, no medals pinned, no citation drafted. No record of the frost line marker system entered into any official file, but among enlisted men the story spread like heat in winter. They whispered across nighttime cookfires. Rourke saw ranges no one else could. What? He turned a fallen tree into a rifle table. He stopped 12 Germans before breakfast. And most telling of all, he saved us. German reconnaissance units discovered the aftermath 2 days later. Snow had fallen again, softening the scene, but the bodies were unmistakable, 12 men, each killed with surgical precision from multiple angles, all before firing a single effective burst. A German NCO examining the positions noted in his after-action report, "Shooter must have known all ranges beforehand, no misses found." Another line translated after the war read, "Unclear how Americans placed a sniper so perfectly. Their manuals do not teach this." The Germans adjusted accordingly, avoided the glade entirely. Stopped using pre-sighted ambush stakes in that sector. Split MG teams across wider ground. Increased counter-sniper sweeps. Whether they ever understood the source, the fallen pine, the frost-etched lines, the machinist's geometry, they never learned. To them it was simply an anomaly, a ghost marksman with impossible precision, a threat they couldn't quantify. When the war finally ended and Eddie returned home in 1946, nothing about Rowley Street had changed. The mill still roared 3 shifts a day. Coal dust still clung to window frames. Kids still chased each other between the row houses. Steelworkers still wiped sweat from brows stained gray by the furnace glow. Eddie walked from the bus station alone, duffel bag over shoulder. His mother hugged him first, hard, then his father gripped his hand so firmly Eddie felt bones shift. They didn't ask about the war, he didn't volunteer details. Within 3 weeks of returning, Eddie